Okay, so now that that's out of the way, just to briefly introduce Manderley. So we are a group started by NYU creative writing students, including myself, Hannah Matheson, and Marissa Davis. And we started about a year ago as we entered into the isolation of quarantine brought on by the pandemic last year. So we began this originally weekly, and now it's monthly, with a series of readings, interviews, and conversations with writers and artists that we admire. And as a collective, our mission is really to use art and these gatherings to combat isolation and in sort of all of its forms, not just through COVID, but in general. And while writing is often seen as an individual endeavor, we want to recognize it as also an important means of stimulating community and collaboration. And we're really thrilled to be continuing that mission with Elizabeth Powell and Leila Chatti today. So I'll soon turn it over to Hannah to introduce our guests, but I just want to add that after the reading, Hannah and I will have a few questions for the readers, and then hopefully we'll have some time for you all to ask questions too. So if you have questions as we go or towards the end, feel free to add them to the chat and we'll be sure to ask them. And also please keep yourself muted just so we don't have any of that like sound interference. But that being said, now I'll turn it over to Hannah.
Yes, it is my distinct honor to introduce our poets, and it's truly so surreal to do this, partially because I met Liz and Leila a couple years ago at the Frost Place, and I have adored their work. And I obviously the situation, the current circumstances are atrocious, but I do love that we are creating virtual spaces where we get to interact with poets from all over at the same time. And I just feel like I struck gold that you guys are graciously reading for us. So we are so excited about this. And Leila will be kicking us off. Leila Chatti is a Tunisian-American poet and author of Deluge and the chapbooks Ebb and Tunsiya, Amrikiya, the 2017 editor selection from Bull City Press. Her honors include a Pushcart Prize, grants from the Barbara Deming Memorial Fund and the Helene Wurlitzer Foundation, and fellowships from the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, the Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing, and Cleveland State University, where she was the inaugural Anisfield-Wolf Fellow in Publishing and Writing. She currently teaches at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she is the Mendota Lecturer in Poetry. Her poems appear in the New York Times Magazine, Poetry, Ploughshares, Tin House, American Poetry Review, and elsewhere.
Thank you. This is so exciting. I love the way that the internet is bringing us together. This year has been a very lonely year, but these readings make me feel very close. And some, like I feel like I see many people sometimes in various readings over and over again, more than I would see in a usual year. So this is strange times, but this is the good part. Thank you. I'm so excited to read with you, Liz. I'm really excited to hear you read. So I'm gonna kind of just go through mine. So get me out of the way and listen to Liz. I think I want to read some poems that I haven't really read from the book today. We'll see how that goes. But I'm gonna start with the first one. And the first poem is titled Confession. It was the poem that sort of let me know that I was writing this project. And it began when I was reading the Quran and stumbled across the passage where Mary's giving birth to Jesus. And she says, "Oh, I wish I had died before this and was in oblivion, forgotten. Truth be told, I like Mary a little better when I imagine her like this, crouched and cursing, the boy god pushing on her cervix. I like remembering she had a cervix, her body ordinary, and so like mine. Girl sweat lacing rivulets like veins in the sand. Her small hands on her knees, not doves, but hands, gripping, a palm pressed to her spine, fronds whispering like voyeurs overhead. Oh, Mary, like a god, I too take pleasure in knowing you are not all holy that ache could undo you like a knot. And suffering, I admire this girl who cared for a moment not about God or his plans, but her own distinct life. This fiercer Mary who'd disappear if it saved her, who'd howl to hell with salvation if it meant this pain. The blessed adolescent who squatted indignant in a desert, bearing his child like a secret she never wanted to hear.
Mubtadiya, which is Arabic for beginner, one who sees blood for the first time. And indeed, appointed over you are keepers, noble and recording. They know whatever you do. The Holy Quran. Hidden in a dim stall as the muezzin called all worshippers to prayer, I touched privately the indelible stain and watched with a nascent sense of kinship the women washing through the interstice of the door, their veils slipping off like water, water spotting their clothes like rain. I thought the thought only children and the pious believe, that I was just like that, no longer a girl. The blood my summons, blot like a seal, a scarlet membership card slid from my innermost pocket. I was newly 12 and wise enough to be frightened. I had read the book and so understood my own was now opening, alighting onto my shoulders like some ethereal bird flapping briefly immaculate wings, and understood too that I myself engendered the ink with which, on its pages, my sins would forever be written. Not literally, but this was how I imagined it, metaphor, as the blood brought God's recorders like sharks to me, Monarch a bright flare, a matador's crimson cape. I had not been good all my life, but until this first vermilion drip, I lived unobserved. My sins, not sins, because no one looked. And now, above, like a lamp suddenly ablaze, God's reproachful eye turned my way, a searchlight eternally searching and seeing and seeing. I was as good as I would ever be. In the dark, the ruddy iris stared back at me. Deluge. And they were oblivious until the flood came and swept them all away. Matthew 24:39. And so it was. 22 and suddenly gushing as if a dam had burst or a thundercloud deep inside the storm of me, the flood like a horse loosed from its stable, blood racing down my thighs. I thought, surely I will die, so much of me outside of me and still more leaving, an exodus, the blood rushing as animals do just before the worst of it, as they must have done before the deluge came. Those left behind, as from their homes the unspared, perhaps one of them a woman my age, looked on with something close to wonder, unaware of what approached. Annunciation. At the bedside, robed in white, a white blaze above a hum of light like a supernal language, a dove in the dark bell of my threshold, pain pealing like a Sunday, the attending announcing shadow, widening the dove's steely beak, a bit of pressure, a sharp pinch, in view on the screen, apparitions, black halos, black seas, void of boats or divinity. They are speaking now. They are trying their best to appear human, so I won't startle, leave, but what they have to tell me, I don't want to receive. The word only incarnate once it slipped in her sleeve. Mary speaks. And what could I say when he entered, rude as a dream, bare flame of a man with wings and demands, not his own? I'd been raised a good girl, to house my tongue in my mouth, to be hospitable toward strangers, suspicious of no one. Perhaps I'd have been better off to be wary, but I'd been waiting so long to hear God speak, I hadn't thought to think of what he might tell me. Watershed. The moment was, to the observer, My boyfriend and God, I suppose, as he is always watching and we were otherwise alone. Ordinary. February waiting for us outside, settled as a marriage, all dull secular light and tepid weather. Inside the room, a pale green, muted and slightly cool, as if under the surface of a pond. I emerged from the bathroom, still shedding blood like water, still leaking like a tap. I had changed into a paper gown, baby blue, with little bows knotted along my spine. My body spiraled back, ungainly, distracted, to hold closed where I was exposed. He said the nurse left something for me on the exam table, a couple of white sheets at the edge. I sank onto blue plush, the stirrups gaping to my left and right like two silver mouths, and then those words, I lifted them so casually. Sarcoma. When the doctor says the word sarcoma, I consider how it might be a nice name for a daughter. That good feminine A, the way parents name their children for all sorts of inappropriate things. Apples, for instance, or the place where the baby was conceived. And I trace my fingers over the barrow of my belly as he speaks, flesh distended beneath the blue tissue I wear for a dress, an ideal grief frock, throwaway. And he says something about life expectancy, but of course I expect my life. So plain, I thought nothing would ever take it. And while he explains, I cut my palms around my center, as if comforting a child or covering her ears. Litany while reading scripture in the gynecologic oncology waiting room. And God said, let there be blood. And God said, flood. And God said, good is a woman with fruit in her womb and not in her hand. And God said, sin. And God did not say, forgive. And God said, I will make a stormy wind. And God said, sun, a breath stirring. And God said, highly favored. And God said, condemned. And God said, I will blot out man whom I have created, for I am sorry that I have made them. And God said, listen, and sank a boy in her like a stone. Tumor. On the scan, a monochrome nimbus of indiscernible material. My own, of course, but its intentions opaque. Its mouth not a mouth, but a zero, a cipher, a space indicating a question it will not ask of itself. It requires me, like a child, to do another thing I'd rather not, to speak on its behalf, to determine its name so I might call it by it, so I might be accurate in my address. This precise knowing, something like tenderness, my obsessive attention and ersatz love, and I cannot turn away from it. Unblinking oculus of my center, blank eye staring from benthic depths, and while I'm at it, it resembles too, I think, if fruit were buried, a chthonic pomegranate, a Pompeian fig cocooned, or else the dark countenance of the moon, one of its seas, or the orphan planet of the dead, motherless stone, God of no and never. Angel. After a month of asking, suddenly a voice. It says you deserve that which has happened to you. It says, I see what you do with your long terrain hands. Maundering through the banalities of my life, it follows, speaking, as if from a frosty bag of peas in the freezer aisle, speaking, while I am on my knees, scrubbing the bathroom floor, trying to love a man. Its speech is disquieting company, but company nonetheless. A TV left on and turned low. It desperately wants my attention, but is polite, which is its defining weakness. Sometimes I catch it stirring out of the corner of my eye, a glint at the end of my cat's whiskers, a spangle on the ceiling of indiscernible source. More often, though, it looks like me, only a little off, like my reflection in the pregnant belly of a spoon. In fact, when I speak to it, I use my own name. I'm not sure if it minds. It repeats instead its refrain. It says, God has plans for you. It says, I didn't say they were good. Eyes opened as God's, and ye shall be as gods, knowing. Like suns I could not lower my gaze from. I admit I liked the warmth of them, tongues in the dark of my ears like secrets, palms splayed upon my thighs like stars. God, I felt you had designed them purposefully for me, as you had once forged my foremother. Felt a tug of primordial hunger, dreamt of snakes that let me hold them, all day eyed the shiny apples of their throats. Hymen. Second blood, I never knew you. After the first, scoured the bed for your blazoned blot and came up empty. Perhaps I was born without you. A box with no prize inside, a sundae with no cherry on top. God of good girls, God of matrimony, mother state, which I consider a distant country with a discordant tongue, did you speak with God and conclude I hadn't use for you? Once I was small as your kin, so small and for such a long time. Longer than I've lived, I fit inside my mother when she fit inside her mother, and so on and so forth, and further, a nest of matrons, me's and a beam, in which to be female is to be something like infinity. And was it determined then what kind of woman I would be? It seems I've always been frightened, little veil, of wedlock's lock clicking shut, the heritable procession of women whispering in the aisle of my pulse, don't do, don't do, don't. And I haven't done. This, the graveman, the grave I've dug with the spade of pleasure. But wanting, seal of want, I did want it. Did choose to commit my life's greatest transgression with a benevolent accomplice, and so in the herebefore, you could say I am among the spared. What a mess this messlessness of you could have been in any number of lives my size, billowing specters of dresses on a line of possibility, lives in which I am the bridesmaid and you, maidenhead, the bride given away, where I am the acquired property and you, the red ribbon severed in the threshold, I, the purse, and you, the coin tendered. Perhaps no one ever told you, precious emblem of innocence, simulacrum for honor, that some believe you the most important part of me, vital, like a heart a man gets a thrill of bursting where he can see it, that blood is owed to him. And that's the heart of it, isn't it? Of a woman, you, the only blood worth anything. Anarchoisa, which is the Greek term for the woman with the issue of blood. Did she, like me, lose years of nights, up at an ungodly hour, washing the sheets? She must have been very tired. She must have been ashamed, waking again to a stain in the bed, still warm like a lover just risen, dayspring seeping over the weedy yard outside. She likely had once a husband, but not long, not after. Because no one touched her, she must have touched herself. She must have known a woman could die from living untouched and preferred to be satisfied. Her red hands turning slowly and brightly like fish under a faucet in the back of the quiet, lonesome house. Sometimes I'm sure she thought her life was all right. She ate, when available, the foods she liked best and moved her chair while reading to the sunniest spot. She presumably prayed for some time, then decided to move on to more fruitful endeavors, like grooming her eyebrows or organizing the kitchen drawer, always a mess. I'm sure she enjoyed a good joke. Occasionally had trouble with self-esteem, generosity. She was the kind to need, like me, endlessly. So when one day that God walked by, all boyish good looks and not looking her way, she didn't for a moment hesitate. She did what I couldn't do. A miracle within reach. She took it. Annunciation. I have come to accept the story of my own obedience. How I waited, not knowing I was waiting. Ear obliging, body poised. You sent a man I could not look at fully or touch. He was a flame which spoke, and I could not be afraid. As it's told, I rose instinctive as a dove, startled into flight, blue veil fluttering floorward and tongue unglued. May it be done to me, I said, and it was done so quickly. I thought to say it meant I had some say, but it was preordained. The breath barely out of my body before my mind had changed. I think I'm going to end with two poems I wrote at the Frost Place, since we're brought here through that wonderful place. And this one's called Myomectomy. At the center of the dark room, an oriole. There, pricked at the wrists by IV cords, robed except for the waist, my body lay reposed and bleeding like the inverse of the child god, my body left open like a window. They entered, innominate doctors, their hands blue as sky, slipping through that oculus to retrieve what had taken root. It resembled a pomegranate when lifted into view. Ruddy globe cradled by two hands, fruit of the dead. But it was not dead, nor was I. I was still living, that bright vermilion my proof. And so, like me, they split my womb right down the middle, the wound precise. And from beneath, the tumor emerged, eager, as if to be born. Bald creature with no father and no future. Savior of no one. And, exegesis. I am smiling because I remember writing this poem right before I had to run to our workshops. Very early in the morning. Exegesis. I bled. God didn't want to hear about it. He said unclean, and so it was. He said it is harm, and so it was. Want to hear about it? He said unclean. Once a woman wanted, so he did her harm. And so it was first conceived, a woman suffering because a woman wanted. So he said cursed, and then he said blessed. The woman chose to suffer, conceived a God though she never knew a man. And God knows best. If he calls a curse a blessing, then so it is. And he said she was clean. She never knew a man. I've known men, but never a God that bled and lived. But I did. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You just read so many of my favorite poems. I feel like I'm so ecstatic. And for those who haven't seen it, on the page, the beautiful poem Tumor that Leila read spirals and the text gets smaller. And so I was so impressed by your graceful reading where you hardly even turned your head. Whenever I read that for the first time, I looked like a mime learning to drive. So just consider me absolutely wowed. And for our next beautiful reading, Elizabeth A.I. Powell is the author of Atomizer, 2 previous collections of poetry, and a novel concerning the Holy Ghost's interpretation of J. Crew catalogs. She is an associate professor of writing and literature at Northern Vermont University and editor at Green Mountains Review. We're so excited to hear you.
Thank you for having me, Hannah and Rachel. It's wonderful to be here. And Rachel, I can't wait to read your manuscript that you described to me in your persona poems. And Hannah and Leila, it's just wonderful to be with your beautiful selves again after spending that nice time in the woods in New Hampshire. So I'm going to read you some poems from my new book, Atomizer. And the first one is called Portrait of a Woman in a Bath. Can you hear me okay? There is no cure for phantom odors. All that summer, an olfactory mirage, specter scents of climbing roses, molting their delirium through my blowing curtains. The aroma of burning hair, leather, horsewhip, diesel. My mother said I had phantosmia as she washclothed my thinking into whatever she wanted, smelling whatever she smelled. I floated until she said the soap bubbles smelled of rusted locks, match strikes. Thus, I never learned olfaction properly, fond of the scent of gas station as much as bakery. In school, all the perfumes of Arabia could not wash Lady Macbeth's hands of blood. At church, Joseph's brothers sold him to merchants bearing spice and myrrh. But here in this Vermont inn, a nude oil painting of a woman in the bath hangs above the towel rack like a gender crucifixion. I float restrained in the small porcelain tub. It is like a coffin of water. The odalisque and I are no mere bathroom selfies, a stay against anxiety, trying to love our bodies. The elusive male gaze floats in from the ether on steam, watches our ritual grooming from the faraway bastion of antiquity's scrutiny, the great school of Athens. The aqua wallpaper skins the wall's surface, light reflecting off water, my hot pink robe. Madness leaks. The ruse and reverie of my toilette has pruned me into the woman I am now, a bather immersed, breasts rising like regimes from an army of bathers, freed from the prison of forever sponging necks in a dega. The bathwater absorbs my bones, dried violet scent and architecture, nanoparticles of wet ferns. In the hydrogen oxygen I float on, the water washing me in places I only let God perfume, his voyeuristic thrill of this secrecy. The next one is called The Ordinary Odor of Reality. And an artist friend of mine set me up to have this meeting with this really interesting man who runs this place where you can have olfactory virtual reality. And one of the main things that technology does is to treat trauma victims, especially veterans. The ordinary odor of reality is as strong as our bones steeped in our bodies. Outer space smells like rum, so says spectral analysis. But all my trauma reeks of baby powder and chlorine. We breathe 86,400 times a day. We ingest each other through our nostrils straight into our amygdala like 80s cocaine or salt water over our heads. I have inhaled my worldview from the sterility of brutalist architecture, schoolrooms I have sat endlessly in. I am having a smell dialogue with mold and wet earth and sand that resides in the woods and playground in my memory. What are your odor threat cues? Coolant, match strike, summer day, all arranged in form, a story. I put on the olfactory virtual reality headset that looks like space goggles with a scentograph that changes with each virtual image in order to confront the aquavelva polyester bedspread, peppermint schnapps, urine, semen, tobacco, the capture and pillage of my 7th year. Now in warrior headdress, I combat the reality of the moment that launched my career into PTSD. Cyber psychological treatment, immunological exposure, therapy to locate the past, so I can crash back through on a treadmill with my space goggles, and therapist and relieve it to master it, and take a shovel to rebury it in the wet earth, but without me. The next one is that I'm going to read is called Shulamite. The Shulamite in the Song of Songs was King Solomon's favorite wife. And so this is my attempt in some ways to write a love poem to that piece of the Bible. Shulamite. One day I stopped this way like Shulamite, the ashen-haired ancestor, that I am my beloved's and his desire is toward me, whether I ask for it or not, because that's what faith is, because that's what Shulamite means. Oh, daughters of Zion, the time for singing has come. His name's perfume, and it pours out on my name. This truth procedure is a composition that is not of the forefinger and a screen and a selfie stick. A society of love cannot be proven in 3 sporty photos, a yoga pose, a bike ride in Vermont, a car selfie. The more I swiped, the more love eluded me. Come away from your computing, children. Truth is the oar in the water, the hand gripping. Belief is the bird call of saints. For the screen does not blossom forth frankincense or liquid myrrh. Many are sad because of their screens. So I will sing to my beloved of how I was delivered from the dynamite of Tinder, the flame of false desires, marketed kisses, the sighting, the sending off, a match that cannot ignite. My life to blast to the core of coquetry's online presences. How I still wear as homecoming, aldehyde, Chanel No. 5. His song forms time and his breath smells of apples and calamus. I adjured him, turn your eyes away from me. They overwhelm. Do not stir up love until it is ready. So my beloved gathers his myrrh and my spice, his Patou poem with my Chanel Cristal, his Dior Fahrenheit with my Bala Versailles girlhood, civet laced and dark in a Parisian bottle. O daughters of Zion, the gazelles and does rise to the summit during the harvest moon. Unsubscribe to dating sites scribed by people who don't believe. For even the moldering hay knows it is sung in the wind not to awaken love until it is ready. For did not my people die of the wages of love? Yes, my people died of the wages of love, yet here I am. Did they not traverse the desert too? Yes. And did they not thirst? Yes, they did not thirst. For beloved, you are the scent between my breasts. I will no longer trust the vagary of electronic nothing, for I am the Shulamite's line. Her adder of mandrake rises in me like testimony, like law. I lay it on the altar of he comes without doubt, without swipe right, without type, without facial recognition, without thumbprint. For I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me, and it gives forth fragrance, his myrrh, my spice. Who writes, who conjures? My beloved contains all of Solomon's songs. He fills the hidden scrolls inside me, and I write the first part of the sentence. He completes it. All his sense sees me. I believe there is nothing more to believe, but, O daughters of Zion, his eyes do not turn away. The next one I'm going to read is called Lying Perfume Bottle of Chanel pour Monsieur. I don't know if you can see this cover art. It's by Laurie Simons, one of my favorite artists. And it's from a photographic series. And this one is called A Lying Bottle of Perfume. And you can see the woman's legs coming out of the bottle of perfume. So this is kind of an ekphrastic poem. And Chanel pour Monsieur was Chanel's first men's cologne, and it came out in the 50s, and it was meant to really represent what we now think of as Don Draper. And funny enough, it was the cologne my father wore, and the person also who's being addressed in this poem. Tell me everything he said. That was the top note. That was what the scent would have said if it could also speak nouns: window, sun, woman, summer, filling the white-walled bistro. How oak mossy the world is, how odor is identity's first ardor. His scent opens a portal. He said I seemed worthy of its lemony, neroli blessings, its cocoa philosophy of my life didn't please me, so I created my life. The light wafts in the window, inflects the room with Vermont in June, languidly arriving on dust motes. I am an object, ponging myself into capture's mendacities. His antediluvian cardamom yanks me, a jazz song my father listened to, or a shape no geometry understands. There's something familiar about the animalic scent, the refined contradiction of all that presses into my plasticine skin. Not all scents register in the conscious mind. I hope to seize his cipher accords inside me like Arcturus flickering. Reader, even the sky has a composition. He sips espresso, eats blue, Bell flirts the morning air. He plays the bow ideal elegantly. Now you tell me everything. I want the aromatics, how the blooming foliage comes over me like a perfume bottle's glass enclosure. I see out a Friday morning, the polite ambition of lovers. This memory an atomizer I'm sprayed out of, droplets seep into pores. Tell me everything. He said it was advertised as a gentleman's scent in 1955 to open over a whole day. How it adorned madmen and rogue. We have nothing left to say about a world that has left us trendy, fetishized, empty. He researched me as an olfactory curator might, my social media Lysol life, how to turn moments into hyper-realism, daughter of the cold hard cell. Tell me everything. My father wearing this scent, tightening his tie, his capitalist noose, thinking he's 007, slapping himself in the face. No woman can know him. Read you the a short poem from the beginning. It's called The Girl from Ipanema, which I don't know if you know that song, but that song was playing in my house a lot when I was growing up. The Girl from Ipanema walked up to me all the way from Brazil to serenade my childhood. All day it was João Gilberto and Bossa Nova. The samba sang only to me. Yet a voice like my mother's began to sing, how can he tell her he loves her? The music petitioning the afternoon for mercy, and then the promise. She looked straight ahead, not at him. My toes in the cold New York Atlantic, blender making music on Fire Island. My father's long coffee-colored fingers smelling of limes. The grown-ups fading into the afternoon's vanishing line. I dragged my red wagon down the sandy lane where I walked, mixture of flower and mermaid bossa. Gilberto and Getz's sonic thump toward the year of my undoing, inside the high notes of my long hair, tangling off key in beach wind and radio sounds. The song sang of the one chord Gilberto had played over and over locked in his bathroom that year when everything was changing. How to understand the new sound of beauty, how a young girl disappeared into an idea of a person no one can have. I will just read a couple more. Stalking me onomatopoetically. And it has a quote, he closed my legs like a book, Angela Carter. Sorry, it's always tea time on Poker Hill where I live. Okay. I sought a restraining order against the sociopathic poem that kept pounding on the door of my mind at 4 a.m., rousing me with a slap on the face with its metaphysics of sick lust and panic. The order was dated March 1st, 2016, a Thursday, raining. The socio-poem smelled of Paco Rabanne, a cologne for men, and was devilishly handsome, so elegant, so English lyrically well anthologized and attractive. Seemed to have a form that suggested well-bred content, an understanding of stanzaic architecture and deep image. Yet this poem I loved had once tried to stab Dorothy Parker at a dinner party, had claimed to have French kissed Helen Wendler and Allen Ginsberg. How could I rationalize or reconcile my love for the poem? The poem tried to kill me too, with the same red child scissors once. Then another time it was tar and feather because the poem said, I love you so much. On therapeutic advice, I sought the restraining order against the poem because it couldn't contain itself, pushed me down with a conceit stronger than my fragile couplets. It leaked anaphora like antifreeze, bluish over the page and into my life uninvited, thinking it knew me better than I knew myself. The poem's arguments were convincing, but it was all fanciful diversion, a lie. All through the day and all through the night, that poem. The poem telling me I looked fat in my Lord and Taylor dress. So I bit the poem's ear again and again until it bled a scary personification of ears, stalking me onomatopoetically down the sidewalk to where I kept my secret sonnet turns inside. I just wanted to take a nap in Brooklyn, sleep inside my source material, that pail of settlement, the origin and end of everything in my family, so that the end of my suffering might bring insight. But the poem turned my nap in Brooklyn into a series of disturbing and surreal faces that awakened me into the possibility that I was the one who was wrong, ruined, damaged, unable to sing. Yet sometimes, honestly, I loved what the poem said when it convinced me of my tyranny. I wanted to let go. I wanted its untouchable love. I waited for the poem, the socio-poem's persona that looked like Mick Jagger, wore leather pants, had biceps, smelled literary and up all night like bay rum and old books. The poem had a spell over me. Its incantatory propulsion got in my blood and bile with its rhythms and made my heart race. It mailed me threatening letters, collages containing articles about what happens to women my age, how they die again and again, alone and withering, like a nasty old tree from a St. Vincent Millay sonnet taught in girls' boarding schools. I wrestled the poem until it swore to bless me, but it blessed me in a language that made me feel uncomfortable. It wasn't a vowel-lick yawp. It was a brutal stuttering ick that made me sick, feel unclean, subway-ridden, which gave the poem a great joy. Thanks.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Liz. I think those poems are so wonderfully intellectual. So hearing you read them was just so brilliant to hear how you're juggling all of that content in such a fascinating way. So thank you so much. Thank you both so much for your readings. At this moment, we'll turn it over to a few questions. So once again, to the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But first, Hannah and I have a couple to ask. My first question is for both of you. In some ways, it feels that both of your work is really invested in telling stories or using narrative elements in the poems. And yet, it also seems that there's a sense of a deeply self-aware I, which seems more lyric to me in that it comes from a world that's very inner and private of the mind and in many ways of the body as well. So I guess I was wondering how you negotiate those two poetic modes, that sort of desire to tell a story and the narrative side of things, and how the lyric self or the I interrupts or works with or comes into conflict with that narrative side of things.
A great question. I feel like I've always felt this conflict about trying to figure out, like, am I a lyric poet? Am I a narrative poet? Which one am I? And I went to like a very narrative MFA program where that was like the school of thought. And so I just assumed, I was like, oh, I'm a narrative poet. I'm a narrative poet. Like, I like stories. And then like the more I wrote, the more I discovered, like, oh, actually, like this I is like very constant and really wants to be there. So I think like it's interesting. Right now I'm working on some poems that feel very different than the poems that I wrote in this book. But that I stays the same. I do think that the I is always there. And I think the story is there too, but sometimes I like to push the story, or like I like to zoom in so close that maybe you only see like one scene of the story as opposed to like the whole arc of the narrative. And I think story needs to be there to give the lyric some anchor or some sense of like gravity or importance of like why are we speaking, or what's the stakes. And for me, narrative often communicates some of the stakes, but I think that how much of the narrative can change. And so sometimes it is like, you know, I'm zooming in on a minute in a life or something. And sometimes it is like, no, here is the, you know, the months that led up to this, or sometimes it's an entire, you know, scene or an argument or something. But it's a question that I'm always wondering about also, is like how that balance of the speaker and the narrative. But I do think that for me, I cleave to that I, that it's very hard for me to imagine writing poems without the I. I'm Team Sharon Olds on that in terms of not taking the I out. I love my I. I guess I love myself. I don't know what that means. I like a speaker.
Yeah, definitely. I definitely see that very much in your work, and the pull of the I, not against the narrative, but in a way it pulls at it, and that helps it work with it as well. And Liz, I don't know if you have a response to that too. To me, your work seems almost essayistic in the way it explores these concepts, but still I feel there's a lyric there too. So I was wondering if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I tend to like the approach of braiding, you know, because braiding narrative, because that's a way to enhance the lyricism and the language and not necessarily follow a straight line. I kind of feel like following a straight line is almost patriarchal in some sense, like history, like we're going to go this way, this way, this way. But also, I also think about like poems as the poet's theology of the world. And I think both Leila's poems and my poems deal with spirituality and sacred texts a lot. And so, you know, I think a theology, if you think about any of the sacred texts, there's a lot of singing and lyricism, but it's always in service to the story, right? And that propulsion of that story, which hopefully is more braided than narrative, but you know, some of them are really straight ahead, like this happened, this happened, this happened. But it's the singing that gets people in and then kind of tricks them into the story, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that the braiding really leads well into my next question, which is that Liz, you read a line in one of your poems that goes, "He researched me as an olfactory curator might my social media Lysol life, how to turn moments into hyper-realism." And that line really struck me when I read the collection, just that notion of turning moments into hyper-realism, and how it feels to me like, in a way, both of your works converge into the hyper-real in terms of their like contemporary discussion of theology, of religion, of politics, of sexuality and love and all of these things. And also maybe especially in their form and sort of their straightforwardness, sometimes directly to the reader. There can be a lack of pretense or just this like very straightforward way of speaking. So and I guess to some, it seems like your gesture towards these topics seems very neatly contained and your attention to them very, very acute, but at the same time, you both manage to hold these massive topics and these massive questions very delicately without reducing their meaning. So I guess I was wondering how, if you approach these topics with the intention of sort of rendering them to be hyper real or contemporary, or if though that aspect of it is more of a means to getting at like this broader, these huge questions about, you know, life and love and religion.
Well, I think to bring up Rilke again, you know, no feeling is final, but I also love that line in Letters to a Young Poet, where he talks about we must live the questions. And, you know, to question anything is to be in a quest, which to me always, even if you're an atheist, has a sort of spiritual bent to it, right? There's always a quest, and narrative needs a quest or a hero. And so I think, you know, that idea of living the questions, after I write, I go for a walk and I just think more in braided thoughts, you know, like I have really bad ADHD. So I'm never, it's that constant braiding. And I think, you know, taking something from politics, taking something from spirituality, taking something from the kitchen, whatever it is, it all is that I, right? That perceiving that I, and how to render that to the reader in a way that is imagistic and able to be seen, or hyper real.
Yeah, absolutely. Leila, I don't know if you had something to add to that too.
Yeah, I love the phrase hyper real. Like that's such a, I'm like just been thinking about that phrase because I feel like things feel hyper unreal right now. And so I was thinking like, what was it like to feel like things were hyper real? I think I wrote Deluge, and I started writing Deluge when I was sick. And so there was a number of poems that's, I was in my MFA. And so I was writing a number of those poems without expectation of them doing anything. Like I didn't really, like I knew that they were poems, but I didn't imagine publishing them, and I didn't, so I didn't have like some sort of like pretense of audience or something. It was really just, oh, I'm learning about poetry. I've always written poems to process, like it's sort of like a diary form for me. So I was just writing these poems I didn't think would ever see anything else. And the whole point of writing them was to try and like document what was happening, and then also like how I felt about what was happening. And in that period of my life was hyper real, hyper traumatic. Like I was very vigilant because I was horrified. And so I think I was like taking in a lot of sensory information, and a lot of those early poems are very like in the moment, like in the hospital, this is what I see, like in, you know, as I'm bleeding, this is what it is. And because it was like the immediacy of like the moment, and my body, I could not see outside of, so I couldn't zero out enough to make any sort of like clever
planning. It was really just, this is all I have to work with. It's like a raw nerve or something, and that's all I can give you is the raw information. And I think in my work, it's very hard for me. Like, I feel like a poem feels dead to me when I'm writing if I can sense myself like kind of playing for a reader. If I feel like I'm, performing, that it's not actually something I feel or think or I'm wondering about, the poem feels really hollow. So for me, there needs to be that little spark of life, which I guess is the real, the risk, the vulnerability, or like the real grappling that I'm doing in there. And I can't fake that. So like, I only really feel driven to write a poem because I'm trying to like figure something out. And if I haven't actually done that, if I'm just sort of like doodling, then that for me is not a poem that I'm going to like put into the world. It just was like a way to, keep myself sharp or something. And I do a lot of doodles, but I think that the ones that I think of as like poems had to have that little breath of the real trouble, the real question, the real realization, if that makes sense.
Those are such thrilling answers, and they dovetail actually with my question. And I'm asking one instead of several because it's very long-winded, because I'm a terror. So my question is, on the surface, your collections can seem formally and thematically distinct, and Deluge narrates a crisis of faith catalyzed by a sudden illness that afflicts the gendered and sexualized body with pain and shame. And Liz's Atomizer investigates the social and scientific layers of modern day attraction through the lens of a perfume dispenser, playing with scent as a site of desire, memory, and trauma. So scent becomes a genealogy or a localized family history. And still, though decidedly innovative and profound in their own ways, both of your collections struck me as books that confront what it's like to be a woman born into the system of differences, where a concept of self is defined by the attention and tolerance of men, whether those be a god or an absent father or a lover. And in some ways, we make deities out of all of these. And your books triumph in carving out a self-definition for oneself. And I'm so happy that Leila read the poem Exegesis, which I think is brilliant. And it uses the pantoum, which is a form that obligates the writer to use the second and fourth line of each stanza as the first and third of the next, and then for the poem to end on its first line. And wonderfully, this poem subverts the idea of preordained life and predestination, because rather than submitting to the concept that human illness separates us from God, she tweaks the line to assert endurance, and it goes from "I bled, God didn't want to hear about it" to "I've known men but never a God that bled and lived, but I did." And I remember reading this poem for the first time, like I have to sit down. I was sitting down. I don't read standing up, but just like needing to take a break. And likewise, Liz pushes back against essentializing categorizations to embrace the complexities and rewards of intersectionality. And I was so drawn to the poem Escape, which posits that her mother's oppression contextualizes but doesn't neutralize her neglect of her children. And the end of that poem is so beautiful. It reads, "I know how the need to solve for X starts to influence how you perceive reality, and the resulting adrenaline can be fabulous. Why look for places to escape from? The room is not a puzzle. It is a container for the puzzle. Back at the closet, I was a glass bottle of distilled silence in an ornate box made of the lavender scare. My mother and her girlfriend never abandoned their city apartment until they were carried out on long white stretchers, where their bodies continued to hold that silence like a library. And after a long time, I saw free children in the park playing with their two mothers, marching in freedom parades, and I cried. And the vacuum silence in my head popped, and one day a window in my heart opened and I crawled out." And I feel like I'm going to cry right now. I'm just leaking all the time. But my question is, after this incredibly long preamble, what was it like to write a book that, like, beyond the admirable ambition of writing a full collection, seeks to redefine who you are for yourself? And Leila kind of touched on this, but do you write to set down what you've discovered, or is the act of writing the movement of thought itself enacting discovery? And So do you write to communicate what you know or to find out what you know?
For me, absolutely to find out. I talk with my students about if you know where the poem's going to end when you start the poem, that poem's already, you don't need it. Like, there's no point. Write an essay, I guess, maybe, or something. I don't know where those things go. An email, I don't know. But the poem should teach you something. And I think, like, I know I finished a poem when it teaches me something. And if I haven't learned something that I didn't know at the beginning, even if it's just like noticing, noticing that something looks like something that I hadn't really realized before or something, like, that's enough of a realization. But obviously sometimes there are much larger consequences or things that you discover. But that's like the work for me of poetry. And I think that's why I write. I think if I figured everything out, I would turn to something more lucrative or, more satisfying. I think, poetry, I write to figure out questions. Deluge was absolutely trying to understand, like, what had happened to me and what it meant for my future, but also like what it meant about my past, that's how I had processed. I really did believe had been cursed by God. I really believed that I had sinned, and I wanted to, once I was beyond the illness itself, wanted to unpack that, and was like, where did that come from? And how is that in the world around me? And like, how do I keep from perpetuating that? Because if I've experienced this, I don't think I'm the only person. And so, like, trying to investigate the roots of that so that my future is different. But I didn't know what the book would teach me. It ended up, the puzzle unlocking for me was understanding that the book was really engaging with shame, that I thought that I was just kind of telling a straightforward narrative of my illness, and then discovered I actually was looking into the roots of shame. But I didn't know that until I realized I was writing around something. And once I finished the final poem, it kicked me out. Like, I really did feel like a push. The final poem was the final poem in the book, the Cento. But once I literally hit the period on my computer, I knew I couldn't re-enter. Like, that book was done. And I felt really sad. I mourned it for a couple of years because I didn't know if I would ever come back to writing another book, because I didn't know what my other questions were. But I have many questions, and maybe once I figure out all of my stuff, I won't write anymore. But I think, right now, whenever I write a poem, it's because there's something I need to figure out. I realized recently I had like a long period of writer's block, and I did all this research into like what writer's block was. Like, I was reading all these cognitive science books about the brain and trying to like outsmart my brain and be like, oh, okay, here's the manual, like beep, 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 like, okay, poems, let's go. So I read all these books on the brain and trying to make myself write. And then I had this realization after like 2 years of really trying to force it, that I wasn't writing because the things that I needed to ask questions about, I wasn't ready to look at. Like, I kept needing, like, keeping myself away from what I actually had questions about. So everything else felt really hollow and forced, because that's not what I wanted to know. And it's not what I had questions about. So now that I've kind of let myself get into that space, finally, after really needing 3 years or so of processing some of those things to a degree where I could start opening that door and peeking into it, now the poems are coming, knock on wood, but they're coming. And I think that's a big part for me, is like giving myself permission to look behind those doors. And then the writing can usually figure out one piece of it and one piece of it and one piece of it. And publishing is when I decide if the thing that I've learned could be maybe useful to someone else. And there's sometimes are poems that I write that I did figure something out that I really needed for myself, but I don't actually think I need to reveal it beyond that. It did its work just through that processing. So for me, writing and publishing are both sort of linked to discovery and understanding. And I won't put a poem into the world if I don't think it's going to give anything to anyone else that's just for myself, I guess, you know, or it's a waste of people's time. There's many poems that will offer other things to people, and I don't want to just put my, you know, my weird musing that is useless to everybody into the world or something. I don't know. That was a very long answer. I hope it was useful.
No, it was a perfect answer. And I think that's really interesting for Liz too, because the poet Brenda Shaughnessy said that people don't talk about like the grief after your first book because everything in your life can culminate in this collection, and then it's like, well, what do you do for your second book? And Liz, I wonder if the discussion of do you write to discover, how that works, because Atomizer covered so much new ground, but it also, I think, is decidedly like in conversation with Willie Loman's Reckless Daughter. I wonder what that process is for you, like every time you start a new book.
Thanks, yeah, Leila, that was really interesting answer, thank you. And I just also wanted to say, I typed this in, but I love this line in your poem, to be female is to be something like infinity. That is so beautiful. And so it sums up my feeling of what it means to be female. And I never thought it was linked to this idea of infinity. So thank you. So you definitely taught me something in that poem. And I just want to acknowledge that. And I think for me, poetry is about ways of knowing. Why I'm a poet is ways of knowing. There's so many different ways of knowing. You know, I could have been a lawyer and then law would have been my way of knowing. Or I couldn't have been a scientist or a physicist because I'm really bad at math, but physics is a way of understanding something and knowing. And I get the feeling that if I can't write, it's because I haven't lived the experience I'm meant to experience yet. And I need to trust that it's coming. But sometimes there are breathing spaces in life, you know, just like intermission in a play. And I feel like I'm getting to the point in my life where I just try now to enjoy the intermission and seek some solace in that. The other period of time where I wasn't publishing a lot, like between my first and second book, but I was writing a lot. I wrote this one poem that's called This Poem is Psychic, because I wrote this whole book that I've never published, and in it were all these images of like a dead father on the side of the road, a secret life, a lost baby. And then I showed it to a mentor of mine, and he's like, there's no narrative here. All these crazy images, what's going on? I was like, I don't know. And then my father died suddenly, and I got all this information about his secret life. And I was like, and all of the images in that book that I've never published because the poems are terrible, because I didn't really know what I was writing about, right? This experience had to happen where all these truths were revealed and those images were somehow in it. So I feel like poetry is psychic, you know, that idea also that Einstein had, that all time is simultaneous. So like we know things, we don't know things. There's this push and pull of what we are ready to learn. Like Leila was saying, like, is the time right? And so I think that's what I want to say about it. So it's like a way of knowing, living into the questions, living into, like when I wrote Atomizer, I hadn't thought so much about how much perfume, one of my mothers was, worked for a French perfume company. She was French. And my sister worked at a perfume as a perfume person, and my mother worked in the fashion business. So it was like a big thing, and it sort of like dropped off for a long time. And then I met this person who was obsessed with perfume, and we started talking, and he's like, oh, you know so much about perfume. I was like, yeah, I know so much about perfume. And then I started to have all these memories about my childhood in perfume stores. And I never thought I would have written about that. I didn't think that was important, and it turned out to be so important. So you never know what life will bring. Ride the wave. No feeling is final.
Yes, I feel like Rilke is really the invisible third reader here. He's with us.
You have like the discovery of your subjects, because I think that's so true. And I know I'm like just beginning to understand sort of, I'm at the start of a career, I guess, like with my first book, but I didn't know this was going to be my first book. I was really adamant that I was going to write a different
book for my first book. The first book I actually started working on at all is what I'm working on right now. But it it took a side track to come over here. And I thought that my first book was not going to be that either. I thought it was going to be a different book. So just sort of like trusting that the subject will sort of knock on you and being receptive to paying attention. I think that's really important, to being like, oh, this is something to listen to. That happens to me with individual poems, but I think projects too. I'm glad you listened, Liz. I'm glad that you noticed this perfume interest, because these poems are amazing.
I know it's almost time to let people go back to their afternoons, but we were wondering if you guys wanted to ask each other a question.
I want to ask a question. There was also a line in one of your poems that I love, like the ache could undo you like a knot. Because a knot's like a puzzle, but it's also something that keeps something from happening. And I love how you handle the spirituality and the spirit and the religious worlds in your poetry in such a surprising way. Like taking these metaphors and similes and stories that we know, but making them so fresh and new and putting new perspectives on them. So I just wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about that part of your writing life.
Yeah. Spirituality has always been, and religion have always been a massive part of my life. In Islam, like it's supposed to be, it's not just a faith, it's a way of living, a way of being. And I knew that, like from a young age. That's like, I understood that was the meaning of my faith. And so I really, and even really kind of my introduction to poetry was sort of linked with faith. I began practicing, reciting the Quran at a very young age, and that, 5 years old. That to me, even though it wasn't poetry exactly, it was doing for me what later I would look for in poetry, which was like this beautiful, musical way of speaking to tell a story and to, communicate through repetition with rhythm. It was so obviously sacred, like the Quran is so sacred that we don't put it on the floor. We have to be really careful with how we touch it. It was all these messages to me very young, was like, oh, language can be beautiful, language can be powerful, language is sacred, books can be sacred. Like all these things were really linked for me. And then, I discovered these rhyming poems, as children do. And I was like, oh, this is kind of doing for me what this does for me too. And so I think that like in my little brain, like those things were immediately linked. So I think of poetry as being very spiritual. And my faith comes in. It was hard for me to see anything outside of that faith because of how all encompassing my religion was, and like the practicing of my faith when I was pretty devout for a lot of my life, and still practicing. And so it was like kind of a daily reminder of like, these are the things you believe, these are the stories that are important. And when I got sick, I was turning to scripture because I was afraid of my mortality and what was going to happen. And I think as a fair number of sick people do, like turn again to their faith to sort of make sense of if they're going to die, like what is the meaning of all of this and these things. But when I did that, I was just fascinated with Mary, as I had been as a kid, but this really like ratcheted up the intensity because I started to think about like, oh, if I'm really practicing my faith, if I'm trying to be like, oh, this is real and so important and everything, then I need to remember that Mary was a woman. Like before all this stuff happened, she was a girl, and then she became a woman, and these things really happened to her. And I was starting to understand like what being a woman was for myself. And so like my way of learning that, because I was in my early 20s, was like turning to this religious figure and being like, where is she appear? Like, where can I find her? Like looking for any stories or like any of the like Apocrypha and things like that outside, and my mother's Catholic. So like just looking at every source that I could find of Mary and trying to like be like, oh, here's a story of how Mary was fed by these, angels and the doves and whatever, like being like, oh, wow, okay, that's cool. That's a little piece of information. And so doing that imagining of having to like
okay, yes, I accept that Mary was a real person, and then I accept that Mary was a real woman, and then being like, what does that mean? So I think that for me in these poems was trying to really embody the stories instead of them just being stories, was to try and apply my knowledge and my contemporary view on what would Mary have been like if she was a girl with me here right now. We were talking about this and talking about God, and that's where that's where the poems came from, was really this genuine trying to understand. It wasn't a game for me or something. I think Persona, I think, is great in terms of trying on all sorts of people, but for me, my relationship to Mary as a character, as a person, was really trying to understand, like, what would that have been like? What would that have been like if an angel came and told you you're going to have God's son? Like, what is that? Like, that's crazy. And I'd never really spent time thinking about what that would have been. And then I realized that was kind of true of how I thought of most people and most women, is like, the things that happened to them. Have I ever actually sat and really thought about what it would be like to be in that experience? Have I like let myself feel that fear or terror? And so it was just, I guess, a lesson in empathy. And because I'm religious, it came from a religious place. That was a really long answer.
And a really great answer. Like, I love when you're talking about embodying the stories, because your poems really do embody the stories. And, like breath as spirit, you're breathing that, your particular breath, spirit, poetic line into those stories to inhabit it. That's a cool, mind-blowing idea. Like, I love it in one of the poems, it's like the egg, we're from an egg that was from inside an egg of somebody else and somebody else and somebody else. I was like, oh yay, somebody else thought that, and was like puzzled by that.
It's wild, right? Like when you're trying to like make sense of these stories, because I feel like even the egg is like a story, because I haven't like seen my eggs, I'm just like, oh la la la. Like, it's just, that's how I'm making sense of it. It's like, well, let me follow that through. Like, what does that mean? Like, really sitting with it. I feel like that's, yeah, I feel like I see that in your poems too, is like this, like, I'm gonna unpack this, I'm gonna study this, I'm gonna go and follow it to the end of its weirdness, like just trailing the idea. Yeah, what I love about your poems is like there's like adventure. I feel like they're like a poem of yours, like it opens up all these things, and I'm suddenly like in different places and thinking about like these lush worlds, we're jumping between sort of like different images and references. That's just, I don't even know if there's a question with that. I'm just like, that's what I like, is following the thing and like really looking and paying attention to things. Yeah. I feel like all my questions, because I'm always such a slow processor, that I always like sit and think of things, and I'm thinking about them for many, many times. So I feel like I don't want to ask you a half-baked question. I'd rather talk to you. I think I'm not on recording about some of your poems. But I was wondering just about, because this has been something I've been asking other writers that have published more books, is like, how has it been for you, like sustaining sort of a longer arc? Because like for me, my experience with writing things has been like a teeny little arc. It's like this one book, beep. And I'm curious about like what your process is with like you had said like, trusting those spaces, but like, do you have like a to-do list of like, okay, these books will come out at one point because I know I want to approach them, or like I love this idea of like the book that was never published. And I'm just kind of curious about like, what is the invisible library of Liz Powell? Like, is there like books lined up ready to go, or do you sort of allow your life to take you right once you finish the next book to what it wants to do?
Yeah, thanks for that question. Life is like a freight train, right? It's just gonna go right at you. So I don't, I'm finishing up a book now about reproductive trauma in all its guises, like abortion, lost children, postpartum mental illness. And I couldn't have written that a long time ago. And now I feel like I can. So, I've been working on that, and part of that makes me, I've had to work on accepting that my own humanity, that I am a person in the world, because sometimes I feel like I'm so self-contained and talking to myself all the time. I don't realize like there's this, that I'm greater than myself, especially during the pandemic. But and trying to embody those stories. But yeah, I found the more I try to come up with ideas for books, they never work. It's picky, like I went to that book that I didn't finish, and I was like, I have nothing to say to this book. And this book has nothing really to say to me right now. Maybe it does at another time, but I really do, my money is really on living the questions and knowing that when I'm stuck on a poem, I just haven't lived that yet. And that makes me more interested in my own life too, and I think more in terms of writing really long lines. Like and I really like how my friend is writing those short sonnet lyrics, and maybe I'll try that. I think more in terms of how can I sort of mix up my formal elements and leave the questions to, God, the world. And I know I'm going to collide with them. And so just be ready to collide, I think.
Ready to collide. That is so good. I love
I'm so interested by that. Vivi Francis told me once that when you feel like you're on a roll with a poem, that's actually a good place to stop, because then you have momentum to return to, as opposed to stopping at an end and then it's hard to re-enter the poem and drafting. And I love reframing being stumped by a poem as like an ongoing process, that you just haven't reached the place where you can finish that. I don't know, that's so much more like hopeful and growth mindset-y, and I'm absolutely going to use that. So thank you both for your beautiful answers.
Yeah, there's a beautiful Galway Canal poem. He was sort of the first poet I really loved. My grandmother had given me selected poems for my birthday, and in it, there's that poem, I can't remember the title now, but the young woman comes into his office and she's sad about a love lost. And he says to her, trust the minutes, haven't they taken care of you till now and brought you to this place? And I think that's the same sort of idea, like just trusting them. Sometimes it's so hard to trust the minutes, especially like once you get to be my age, you're like, I don't want them to go too fast. How can I trust you? But I think
so lovely. Thank you so much for reading for us and for engaging in this conversation. I know I will be thinking about it for so long, and I'm so glad we have it recorded. So I don't know what else to say, but thank you. I'm so I feel so ecstatic, but not in a hyperactive way. I also feel very calm. So both just very full.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both so much. This has been such a refreshing and thought-provoking hour and a half, and we really appreciate you both taking the time to speak with us and speak with each other and read your wonderful work, which feels in dialogue in so many ways. So I'll post our website to the chat, but this, as we mentioned, is recorded. So hopefully soon we'll be able to put that up online, and everyone can feel free to share with friends and family and people who weren't able to be here. But yeah, thank you both so much again. And we hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
This is so wonderful. And thank you, Liz. This is so good. I can't wait till, God willing, the world opens up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, just such a pleasure to be with you all. I wish you all good things. Thank you.
Thanks. Oh.